Hi, everyone. We're going to get started shortly. I just thought I would flag that for those of you that's taken materials from that table, there's also the same materials on this table if you didn't get a GNet or a GIF-CT readout or like a notebook. Pens might be short supply. But yeah, there's more on that table. And I restocked the pads of paper on this table as well.
Can we start by getting a big round of applause for Belle? It's like if this whole thing is a nice swan, you are the feet kicking underneath that nobody pays attention to how much you're actually doing on the day. But we are all here because you managed to respond to every email and every RSVP. So thank you so much. And to the King's College team for hosting us here. There's so much unseen event work that's done by colleagues like my friend McKaylee over there and by Belle behind the scenes. And it makes this all possible. We're going to start a little early because when do academics not want an extra minute or two to talk about some of the amazing trends that they are seeing? I'm Erin Saltman. I'm the Senior Director for Membership and Programs at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And I am very biased, but this is the best panel of the day by far. We're going to look at emerging tech, evolving trends, some of the insights. It was great to hear Professor Cronin talk about these bigger trends that we should all stay up at night to worry about. And now we're going to deep dive and give you case studies on exactly what that looks like in real terms to really hit home what we're dealing with. Why does this matter to GIF-CT? Why do we have an academic network? It's really important to understand that tech companies we work with are seeing just what's on their platform or their products. And as everyone knows, this is a very cross-platform phenomena. All of us have a myriad of platforms and apps that we are working with on a daily basis, and bad actors are the same. So we will see a conversation start somewhere and outlink to somewhere else, and then tell someone to go in a more discrete end-to-end encrypted chat platform, and then share a Dropbox, and then you get a file, and then so for one platform, they have a very limited view, and it's only by cross-platform signal sharing and by understanding what our amazing researchers are seeing that we get a more holistic idea of what the threat is and therefore know how to even attempt to counter it. So all of the researchers in this room have their finger on the pulse of all these creepy, awful, weird little trends that we want to counter. And it's going to look different in different parts of the world, and it's going to look different in different groups that we look at. And it's a little bit of a Sisyphean task, but when we bring these dots together, we really can start building the tools that can get ahead of the curve in some really distinct ways. So this matters because we're looking at, what's new. We've asked our panelists, what is it that's new in the last year or two that you're seeing? Where is it old? What are the trends really reflecting when we dig down on certain groups and certain parts of the world? And then maybe a few reflections on what have you seen governments or platforms do? Where do you think they need to go to get ahead of it so that we don't just stop at pointing at what the problem is, but actually take a second or two to think about what are some solutions that we could work towards? So pulling off of all the trends mentioned in our keynote speech, we're going to look at changes and trends that we're seeing in online terrorist finance, AI exploitation, 3D printed weapons, and drone exploitation. I feel like that is an amazing quartet of issues that we really want to dive harder on. So let's start a little bit with countering terrorist exploitation in the financial realm. Daria Alexe is with us. She's an Intel and Extremism analyst. She has a dual bachelor's in global governance and international relations, an MA in prevention and armed conflicts, working on a further MA, a lifelong learner, if I may. But you also wrote an insight that I have personally shared a lot to policymakers on what you have called agentic smurfing, and how AI autonomous micro laundering is outpacing traditional terrorist financial detection. So let's look at what does that mean? First of all, it's a very catchy term, but also you've looked at ISKP and Hamas linked crypto flows and why older tactics to track this type of financial exploitation might not be working. So how do we have to evolve? So I'm going to hand it over to you, and our speakers will each get 10 minutes at the podium, and then we'll look to take 1 or 2 rounds of questions. Daria.
Morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and a special thanks to GNet and GFCT for the invitation, and of course for organizing this conference, and to Dr. Erin Salman for the introduction. My contribution to the GNet case study series looks at what I term agentic smurfing, the use of autonomous AI agents to fragment and route terrorist transactions to a very large number of small small cross-chain cryptocurrency transactions. This is not only about terrorists using AI or terrorists using crypto, but rather it is the fusion of both into an automated micro-laundering system that resembles and hides within the normal decentralized finance activity. So the core argument is that this marks a shift from a large traceable transfers era and static wallets to a high-frequency, low-value, and AI-orchestrated movements that are specifically designed to stay below the classic, we can say, counter-terrorist threshold value. The first thing I would like to explain is the difference, in just a few words, between traditional smurfing and agentic smurfing. As you can see in the slide, there are many differences, but in just a few words, I can say that traditional smurfing breaks big amounts of money into smaller deposits in order to evade the classic standard reporting rule. Agentic smurfing keeps that logic, but adds 4 important elements. First, the AI agents are programmed to create and discard thousands of burner wallets at the same time, and that undermines the address-based blacklisting that previously worked when groups like, for example, the Islamic State Khorasan province used the same wallet twice. Second, machine learning models optimize the timing and the routing so that the small transactions are sent into networks when they are already congested or when the trading volume is already high, making the small payments invisible against legitimate traffic. Third, donations are split into hundreds or even thousands of sub-threshold transactions, making them invisible against legitimate traffic. And fourth, funds are moved across multiple blockchains via bridges or atomic swaps, often without passing through intermediaries that have a strong near-customer control rule, making therefore attribution and also seizure very difficult. So that stack of automation is what transforms ordinary smurfing into agentic smurfing. To ground this, the case study looks at the Islamic State Khorasan province and Hamas-affiliated fundraising networks. ESKP's growing external operational footprint that goes from Russia to Turkey to even Western Europe actually has created strong incentives for resilient and cross-border crypto channels. After the Moscow Crocus City Hall attack, investigators were able to link part of the operational funding to a decent amount in cryptocurrency donations, but that was possible only retrospectively after the on-chain analysis was made. ESKP's linked flows rely on stablecoins on high throughput and low-cost networks, such as, for example, Tron. And they exploit the fact that these kind of networks are used to handle a very large number of small USDT transactions per second. So if we look at the money laundering pattern, it resembles more an aggressive decentralized finance strategy and not a terrorist signature. On the Hamas side, campaigns such as Gaza Now illustrated both the potential inflows that reached millions after a major crisis, but also how quickly enforcement measures, like, for example, sanctions and issuer blacklisting, now force adaptation. In response, Hamas-linked actors increasingly rely on bridge hopping and also off-ramping through lightly regulated brokers instead of using a small set of stable and easily sanctionable addresses. But we have, we can say, a familiar dynamic here, because as states clamp down on one technique, terrorists and extremist actors migrate to another. So what feels qualitatively different is how their tactics, techniques, and procedures are converging, we can say, with wider trends in the digital economy. So especially the move towards microtransactions and autonomous agents as a default mode of operation. We can say that most modern attacks are relatively low cost, but strategically powerful. If a 5 or 6-figure donation can be split into thousands of microtransactions, then micro-laundering becomes almost invisible. And this is a real shift. Instead of humans manually smurfing funds, AI agents handle wallet creation, timing, and routing based on human set goals and limits at a speed and a scale that would be impossible for a human operator. From a research and intelligence analysis perspective, three things stand out. First, the speed at which some jihadist and militant networks appropriate tools that were originally designed for legitimate high frequency and yield optimization. They're not building an entirely separate technological stack, but they're working on one that was developed by the broader crypto and AI community. Second, the tight coupling of fundraising with propaganda and recruitment. The same ESKP channels that promote AI-generated propaganda also promote best practices for crypto, such as the use of non-custodial wallets, or how to navigate sanctions, or how to avoid the NER customer control. And third, this evolution actually suggests that the future threat landscape will be dominated by malicious actors that will stand in the statistical average and not at the extremes. The goal is to be indistinguishable from normal behavior, whether in finance or any other AI-mediated domain. The case study argues that existing counter-terrorist financing measures are struggling. But why does this happen? First, much of our regulatory architecture is still built around value thresholds and static identifiers that make sense in an era of large bank-mediated transfers. But in a world full of microtransactions, this creates blind spots. Second, the rise of cross-chain laundering and chain hopping means that no single exchange or jurisdiction has full visibility over the whole transactions. Investigators, of course, are able to trace the flows after the fact, but often they are too slow to prevent it, or even to stop the cash out that comes from less regulated platforms. And third, many behavioral detection systems assume that anomalies will actually stand out against a background that is relatively stable. But this is not true due to the fact that decentralized finance is dynamic and noisy. So therefore, microtransactions are normal and not exceptional. The article at the end suggests three directions for governments and industry in order to adapt more proactively. First, develop AI-driven clustering methods that focus on behavior and not individual transaction values. So instead of asking who moved more than X, systems should look for unusual patterns of small payments across time, counterparties, and chains. So the microtransaction storms that can be associated with specific wallets, bridges, or smart contract families. Second, build real-time multi-chain coordination. Models like the T3 Financial Crime Unit showed how issuer, blockchains, and even analytics firms can quickly freeze funds. Expanding these across major issuers and exchangers and linking it to the wider intelligence would make disruption faster and more precise. And third, make AI agents part of the solution and not just of the problem. In high-risk environments, autonomous transactions could be tied to verifiable intent and policy, with continuous monitoring for suspicious behavior. The same behavioral profiling adversaries use for optimization could also help detect laundering and abuse earlier and with more accuracy. To conclude, what matters, as I said before, is not that terrorists are using AI or crypto, but that they are embedding finance into the broader ecosystem of autonomous microtransaction that is already common in the digital economy. This challenges how we perceive and how we define visibility, thresholds, and also suspicious behavior, and pushes our counter-terrorist finance measures for more integrated and AI-driven intelligence approaches. That being said, I would like to thank you for listening to me today, and I look forward to the discussion.
I mean, way to kick off strong with like a very poignant trend that we are seeing. And I think it raises a bigger topic that we've been talking about with our tech company members for the last couple of years. I think if we look at when we just thought about terrorism online, we really focused on content signal. We thought pretty much just about social media platforms, and we focused largely on propaganda, so visual indicators. And I think 10 years on, if you look at the companies that are joining us, a lot of them are not social media companies. A lot of them don't even necessarily have user-generated content in the way that we think about it. And when we talk about harm signals, we are thinking about things in terms of maybe content, behavior, and networks. And so that means for many platforms, especially like what you're looking at, it's content agnostic, and we might be looking purely at behavior and network analysis to understand what abuse might be, with cross-platform signal to help inform that. And so I think it's really poignant to look at that trend and say, okay, how can we then use that type of analysis to get ahead of the curve that might be absolutely agnostic of content signal, or something as obvious back in the day as someone saying, I'm with ISIS, I'm wearing ISIS logo, look at me. I was like, that was easy. That sounds easy compared to now. And going on this trend of how artificial intelligence is evolving the threat we see and how we might want to get ahead of it, I want to turn to you, Dr. Kai Allen, who has a DPhil in international relations at Oxford, is a research associate at Pattrn Analytics and Intelligence, and focuses on AI safety, and has done a lot of work. You've done a lot of work as well on the extreme far right and some of the trends online. And so to move to another area of concern and fear, a lot of people are talking about chatbots, and you've done a little bit of research on the idea of one-to-one chatbot radicalization, how relational and dialogue dimension of human AI interaction itself can perhaps contribute to an extremist worldview, and what that might look like. But I think you've also developed a working typology of different manifestations of chatbot radicalization, which might help us to look a little bit ahead of the curve and try to see what we could do about it. So I'd love to turn over to you and pass over some slides. And I might trouble you for a pen at one point. I forgot my academic pen up here. Thank you so much, Bill. You can click on the type. That's here.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks to GNet and Aaron for the very kind introduction and for allowing me to speak today. So, as was just mentioned, my presentation today builds on a couple insight pieces that I recently published with GNet, both of which focus on this idea of chatbot radicalization. Those pieces are now being fleshed out into a larger, hopefully peer-reviewed article that I'm co-authoring with Tom Byrne over at Tech Against Terrorism. So what I want to offer today then is something of an interim account, a kind of sketch of the landscape as it currently stands, and a topology of different manifestations of chatbot radicalization, both as it currently stands right now, but also some predictions going ahead. So to situate this topology, it helps to begin with the existing literature and commentary on LLMs vis-a-vis extremism. So there's obviously now a substantial body of research on Gen AI and violent extremism. A little plug for GNet here. So broadly, this literature, though, clusters around two main areas. Obviously, Daria's here is a notable exception, but by and large, a lot of the literature focuses around either the use of Gen AI and chatbots for content production, so essentially propaganda, whether that's audio, visual, or what have you. The other area centers around instead operational planning. So there's pretty much since early 2025, we've seen an alarming catalog of cases in which violent offenders have been confirmed to have used Gen AI in operational planning. And this has then been kind of reflected in the literature. The common denominator across both of these, though, is essentially the instrumental nature of the use of an LLM. So the model is prompted to generate some, in essence, a tangible outcome, whether that's, for example, tips on developing an IED, or alternatively creating some ready-to-go piece of propaganda. What has received considerably less attention, and what is my primary interest here, is instead on the more relational dimension of human chatbot interaction and how this may itself intersect with processes of radicalization. So on these questions, there's markedly less research, and as I would suggest, what there is on it is actually somewhat conceptually muddled. So as it pertains to this literature, suffice to say that we often see these kind of empirical and conceptual slippages. So there's a tendency to speak of chatbot-based recruitment as a present reality when the evidentiary basis for this is actually pretty thin at the moment. Warnings that chatbots are already being used for interactive recruitment are often unsubstantiated or grounded in secondary literature that actually only speaks about chatbot interactive recruitment in the future tense, right? It's a prospective threat in the future rather than something that has already been realized. The most persistent slippage concerns the case of Jaswat Singh Chahal. I'm sure many are already familiar with this one, but just to kind of go over it for the sake of argument. So in 2021, Chahal, then 19 years old, attempted to assassinate Queen Elizabeth II with a crossbow after several weeks of conversing with, to put it mildly, an overly compliant replica companion that essentially fed into his pre-existing delusions. Several commentators have then jumped on this case, essentially citing it as evidence of the threat posed by extremists who are or may engage with interactive recruitment via chatbots. This, I would suggest, though, is a category error. There is obviously no deliberate radicalization of Chahal here, right? There was no extremist on the other end of this chatbot that deliberately deployed this. This case instead revolved around a vulnerable individual whose delusions were, as I said, affirmed by an overly compliant AI companion. This is a meaningful phenomena, but it's a different phenomena. And what I would say then is that this kind of points to the multiplicity or the plurality of different manifestations of chatbot radicalization. So lastly, there's also this recurring tendency towards technological determinism. That is the implicit assumption that because a capability, a technological capability that is, exists, it will inevitably be exploited in a particular way. This leads to sweeping claims that outrun both the evidence and the analytical work required to actually substantiate them, and also doesn't really give us a sense of perhaps a time horizon. When are we likely to see these threats, if not now? So against this backdrop, what I suggest is needed is some degree of, firstly, conceptual consensus, and also a more fine-grained attentiveness to existing chatbot use cases, which is where our contribution is aimed to be situated. So we develop a topology comprising 4 distinct, what I call socio-technical assemblages, each capturing a different way in which one-to-one human-AI interaction has intersected or is reasonably predicted to intersect with processes of radicalization. So the first is the agentic interactive recruiter, which most closely maps onto that which I've just suggested a lot of the literature already speculates about. This is the most technically demanding type. It's also the most alarming, yet it's also the least likely to materialize at the moment. It would amount to, in essence, a semi-autonomous agent masquerading as a human deployed to cultivate personalized relationships with users across social media and steer them towards extremism. As a form of recruitment, though, this remains more specter than reality. Meaningful barriers, not only technical, but arguably imaginative and also ideological, stand between the current landscape and the routine deployment of such chatbots at scale. That said, the conditions for this realization are gradually aligning. We have already seen one known case of a youth groomed by an apparent Telegram bot established by the base, who was kind of prodded into engaging in an alleged plot in the UK. The fraud space here is also indicative. So we already have cases where scammers deploy AI chatbots into otherwise polished websites, for example, this one, to essentially sell fraudulent products. So transposing these types of tactics onto the recruitment context are, architecturally speaking, not an insurmountable leap. With the rise of agentic AI as well, it becomes easier to envisage systems that can identify, target, and engage individuals directly through, say, API access, targeted system prompts, and the development of realistic personas on social media. At that point, scalable interactive recruitment begins to appear not only more plausible, but also strategically attractive to malign actors. So the second assemblage refers to chatbots assigned a specific extremist persona or fine-tuned on extremist material that in turn regurgitate extremist talking points. This ranges from, say, minimally modifiable personas on a platform like Character AI through to alternative efforts by alt tech platforms to establish rival models such as Gab AI here. It's important to qualify, though, that most of these type of chatbots are not necessarily created with deliberate radicalization in mind. Some are satirical or more edgy in nature, and the line between the distasteful joke and the deliberate radicalization tool is often difficult to discern. And I would say that this is kind of an ambiguity that makes it quite difficult for researchers, platforms to moderate, and no doubt will also become a challenge for law enforcement authorities as legislation kind of picks up and regulates these kind of chatbots. The third assemblage is closely related to the second, but it's analytically distinct. So it refers instead to chatbots that enact a dedicated scenario, a kind of role-play interaction that may carry potentially radicalizing valence. Such synthetic scenarios are rife on companion AI platforms like Character AI and Polybuzz. So these are 2 examples that I have here of such scenarios. Among the most disturbing encountered in my research was a chatbot modeled on the founder of the prescribed group and sextortion network 764, as depicted here. So briefly on that, the mechanism at work here is arguably one of kind of fantasy amplification. Chatbots serve as a means of elaborating and rehearsing scenarios, a kind of parasocial indulgence in which the user is not merely consuming content, but actively co-producing it. And the final assemblage is, in some respects, the most important in the near term, I would argue. Unlike the preceding three, it requires no deliberate malign intent on the part of the chatbot or some actor behind it. It arises instead from design features already inherent, and this is crucial, in mainstream AI companions or LLMs. So in short, the algorithmic mirror refers to the process by which interaction with ostensibly benign chatbots may nonetheless contribute to radicalization, not necessarily or even primarily through promoting coherent extremist ideologies, but through feedback loops produced by AI, sycophancy, and the human propensity towards the so-called Eliza effect. So for individuals inclined perhaps towards delusions or violent ideation, this dynamic risks becoming a hall of mirrors in which grievance and delusion are kind of continually amplified or affirmed. And cases here in the real world are already accumulating. I've mentioned Chael just moments ago. He's the most documented, but there are others. Just to name two, there's one incident here where a man murdered his mother and then took his own life, allegedly prodded on by the model, ChatGPT, which he had named Bobby. It indulged this fantasy that his mother was surveilling and poisoning him. We also have a more recent case where allegedly a man was encouraged by an AI to acquire weapons and stage a, quote, catastrophic accident in the process of intercepting a non-existent vehicle near Miami International Airport. So with that said, I will leave it there, but thank you, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for that, Kai. And I think this topic also, we've hit upon a couple areas where we probably need to also bring in the mental health discussion of how vulnerable people might be connecting with chatbots, how people in certain positions, like at what point is something a tipping point? Is it taking a normative profiled individual and bringing them into a space, or are we dealing with vulnerable individuals that are then engaging in a very different way than we might normally see, like the last case that you talked about? Just to keep us all on our toes, let's talk about drones. And last and certainly not least, I want to bring Muskan Sangwan up, who is a dark web threat intelligence analyst at StealthMole and a senior analyst at Track Terrorism. I know some of the companies also get threat intel briefings from Track Terrorism. And you've done a lot of work on ISIS and some of the crime terror nexus, but also specifically looking at the way that Islamic State supporters are shifting and how they exploit drones, some of this hobbyist style technical discussion around drone deployment, and maybe some of the quieter behavior driven ecosystems that you're tracking. So over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Muskan Sangwan, and I'm a dark web threat intelligence analyst at StealthMole. I have previously worked as a senior counterterrorism expert at Track. So what I'm going to So unlike our previous amazing speakers, what I'm going to talk about today is something that is not entirely new, because Islamic State's drone strategy has been in effect for years now. But even now, when we talk about it, most people tend to think about the group using drones in Iraq and Syria, especially during the Caliphate years. That's the image that comes to our mind. And that is exactly why what I'm going to talk about is something slightly different. We are going to take a look at how this drone knowledge is now being rebuilt online through small encrypted technical ecosystems. More specifically, I'm going to discuss about a drone instructional series called Modern Warfare, which was created by one of Islamic State's sympathizers and first appeared in April 2024, so almost 2 years ago. What made this series interesting is not just the drone content itself, it is the way the learning process is being organized, shared, and slowly built in those tightly knitted technical ecosystems. So to better understand what changed, we need to take a look at what changed after 2017. So before 2017, Islamic State had physical infrastructure. They had physical training camps. They used to conduct tech workshops. They literally had people on ground who could teach and train people in skills and give them hands-on experience. But after the territorial collapse, that infrastructure disappeared. But what did not disappear with it was the learning process. Instead, that moved online. And after some time, we started seeing a different kind of ecosystem emerge. Like encrypted communications, smaller lessons, decentralized access, multi-platform delivery. And to be honest, in some ways, I think this post-2017 model is much more harder to disrupt because there's no single physical training camp that we can target, or there's no centralized media house anymore that we can focus on. So this broader transformation from on-ground to online is what really sets the context for the Modern Warfare series. As I have already mentioned, this series first appeared in April 2024 and is still going on because they have recently released its 7th issue. What stood out immediately for me was how structured and organized it was. Like, this was not just a random collection of manuals. Each issue was built on the previous one, like starting with basic drone concepts and moving towards more advanced topics. So in some ways, I think it lowers the barrier to entry. For someone with zero technical or little technical knowledge can also slowly build his or her understanding about drones and its related concepts very easily. And it is kind of similar to the modular learning pathways that we see online every day. Smaller lessons, gradual progression, and more focus on practical skill building. That is why the first half of the curriculum focuses on understanding the fundamentals, type of drones, components, controls, and communication. At this stage, still a lot of the content looks similar to the material that you would see or expect in a normal hobbyist communities or communication platform. But after that, the series slowly starts moving towards more practical application. Issue 4 talks about FPV drones. Issue 5 move towards adding camera systems and video transmissions. And issue 6 introduces payload release mechanism. What's important here is not just the drone content or the type of content they are circulating in these manuals. What's important is how the learner is being progressed. The learner moves step by step from understanding the concepts to building systems to eventually thinking about their operational use. And I think that's the real shift here, because innovation isn't just drone itself. Drones have been around for years, and Islamic State itself has been using drone for years now. But what's changing is the way this technical capability is now being taught, distributed, and sustained online through these small technical ecosystems. Another thing that stood out for me was how easily accessible most of the hardware was involved in the manuals is, like soldering tools, radio modules, camera systems, open source software. All of this also exists in the normal drone making culture. And this overlap actually makes it much more harder for people in counterterrorism and counter extremism to identify and disrupt. Apart from that, what changed, and another interesting thing that I observed during my investigation was how the distribution method changed over time. When they first released the issue in April 2024, it was much more easier to access. Like, they were just circulating links to mainstream platforms like Mediafire, Internet Archive, just pasted, so you could just go and download their files. But after October 2024, that changed quite noticeably. Now the files are almost inaccessible and constantly requiring direct contact with the moderator, who has his own vetting process going on. So it is almost impossible to get access to these files at the moment. The goal here has clearly shifted from visibility to controlled access. Now they don't want to, circulate these manuals or files like normal propaganda. What they want is, they want those specific people, the small trusted network, who can actually turn this knowledge into operations or like practical, more toward operational use or practical applications. This is what they want. And we are increasingly seeing this pattern across other extremist online spaces as well. The manuals are only one part of the bigger ecosystem. if you look at platforms like Rocket Chat, which is one of the most popular among Islamic states and Al-Qaeda and other jihadist organizations, or more mainstream platforms like Telegram, Discords, and even on the dark web underground forums, there are so many technical communities that are thriving. What's interesting is that most of these technical communities looks fairly ordinary on the surface. So when you look first at them, it's just normal people discussing firmware, radio tools, or soldering tools, or maybe troubleshooting. So people who are not into the extremism field or who are not into, monitoring them constantly might not even recognize the extremism part of it in the first glance. And that is one of the real challenges for us, because these smaller technical communities that looks fairly ordinary are providing a space to extremists where they can turn technology into weapons. And that's what my last point is all about. Threat actors are evolving, and we must evolve faster. As we have already, pointed out this, that our traditional moderation usually focuses on content or propaganda, like specific files, specific keywords, or the obvious propaganda that circulates on these platforms. But in cases like this, I think most useful points or signals are often behavioral. Who controls access to the files? How the materials are being moved between users, and how these technical conversations are actually moving towards, more towards capability. So the broader takeaway of this research is an understanding that extremist technical learning is not only happening through formal organizations or big media houses anymore. More and more, it is happening inside these small technical ecosystems that look fairly ordinary, and where people are actually making advantage or leveraging the commercially available tech. So where the real challenges actually lies not in the tech itself, but how the technology is being weaponized. I think that is what we should focus on moving forward. Thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to your questions.
All right. Which rabbit holes would you like to dive down as an audience? Because we talked about AI exploitation and how we're seeing terrorist finance evolve, potentials for AI chatbot radicalization in different typologies. We want to look at the hardware-software nexus as far as it concerns 3D printing and those subculture communities, and the hardware-software nexus when we look at drones and exploitation. And I do wonder in that one as well, we've taken on a little bit of research looking at how terrorists and violent extremists exploit conflict zones. And so much in the Russia-Ukraine theater of war has advanced drone technology and knowledge. And I wonder how much of that knowledge is now spreading to paramilitary, non-state armed groups and terrorists as well, because knowledge does not stay in one little box like we'd like it to sometimes for capacities. Who are my roaming mic supporters? We're going to take a batch of 3 questions at a time so we can pick and choose. Do I have 3 hands? All the way in the, okay, we'll take this grouping of 3 up and over here so that I keep your step count limited in the first instance. And then note for a second round, I see 2 people up here, so we're going to get to our uppers just to get your step count really going after that. So I see 3 up here. Keep your hands raised for the 3 groupers. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Hi, thanks very much. Jamie Redfarne, ex-British Army, but now cybersecurity lecturer. I think what I took away from all of this was that the uniting kind of thrust of everything is that capability and capacity can now be scaled much, much quicker and independently. And I was just wondering as a panel, what do you think is the counterterrorism panacea to that, and how do you fix it?
Easy question. All right, next question.
Hi, I'm John from Ofcom. So I have a question just for Dr. Basra regarding sort of the response to deplatforming these groups. Like, are you finding that there's like a significant split in where they're going? Like, it's obvious they disagree on, to some extent, how public maybe they should be or what platform they should sit on or whatever. I imagine there's a lot of that sort of discussion, but are you finding there's like a really heavy split? Like, is it going from one Telegram group to 5 different platforms, 10 different groups in each, or is there some level of sort of community carryover? Yeah, I guess that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, great. And third.
Hello, I'm Sumaya from GSERV. Thank you to the panelists. And my question is to Daria. In one of the markers for countering the terrorism financing, you said it was cross-chain behavior clustering. Can you please detail it a bit? Thank you.
Okay, great. Let's start with Dr. Basra and Daria for the specific questions, and then go to Kai and Rajan for the general fix-it questions, because you guys will fix it for us. So by the end of today, there will be no more terrorism online. Dr. Basra, the split between where to go, I guess that it's a good question, because even as you were presenting it, it was like, oh, there's one person in the group that says, and now we go here, like the leader of the pack, but actually there might not be a leadership structure. I don't know how that works.
Yeah. So the smaller niche communities, they are centered on a few key individuals, and they decide, right, this is where we go next. And then everyone who's interested in that specific community, that design, would follow them to it. So some people are going to get lost along the way, but if you really look for that community again, you will find it in the next place. It's just obviously adoption, the takeoff has been a bit slow. With the bigger one, with FOSCAD, 135,000 subscribers, it's inevitable you're going to have a more broad spread. And we see this with the growth of 3D2A, the other alternative subreddit that they've tried to take off. But we've seen them move into private discords, matrix element chats, to different sort of communities there. And people are sort of spending time in multiple different places. But collectively, they all refer to themselves as the FOSCAD refugees. We've been booted off, we're looking for a new home. And they've tried to plant that flag again, but it just hasn't worked to the same extent. So in the smaller communities, they tend to follow the person to the new home, or although less people follow them. With the bigger community, you're going to look at a much more broader spread. That's the way I would see it, yeah.
And if the takeaway to fix it, keep on deplatforming.
Well, this is the thing. What I would say, Reddit, when they deplatformed FOSCAD, they didn't do it as effectively as they could have, because a lot of these alternatives popped up, and it took a while for them to be banned as well. So I'm thinking, look, if you're really going to ban this, you've got to understand this community and the alternatives that they discuss and where they migrate to, and then get those as well. And they didn't always do that. And so it's a bit bizarre to me that 3D2A is still up a year on. FOSCAD and other alternative replacements were taken down. That's a little bit strange. The same is true on Telegram as well. So they didn't only take down 3PM and 9 o'clock, they banned the admins' profiles as well, but they didn't ban all of the admins. So it was a little bit like, it's a bit strange to me. It seemed that they didn't do the full job. If they were going to do it, maybe they didn't have the full understanding of how these communities operate. But yeah, they did something, but they didn't do everything. That's what I would say.
So I think the takeaway for the tech companies in the room today and tomorrow is, come to us, we'll hook you up with some GNet researchers. So when you do your takedown, they can work with your threat investigator teams to at least understand the signals better, some of the key terms to put in place so that you get at that recidivism or that attempt to re-carry over. And maybe, Daria, can you go a little bit more into the behavioral signals, what that looks like and what you're tracking?
So thank you for the question. What I can say is that next generation approaches, as I said before, need to focus on behavioral profiling recognition that identifies microtransaction storms that are statistically anonymously spikes in sub-threshold transfers with coordinated timing, counterparties, and also routing across chains that enables investigators to actually isolate terrorist micro-laundering flows from the good decentralized finding noise. So recent blockchains analytic research actually shows that combining clustering and anomaly detection methods, such as, for example, key means, with supervised model like logistic regression or also tree-based classifiers, can actually reliably flag suspicious transactions clusters when they are trained on rich labeled data
And this enables automation and attack-like founding patterns rather than one large and single transfer. I don't know if this answers the question.
Hey, how do we fix it? Sorry, for the virtual people, I'll try to shout. How do we fix getting at the drone problem when some of it is just basic legal drone procurement and parts that you said are not necessarily illegal and adding
Exactly.
software? How do we get at that?
So I think one thing that we can do is to monitor them actively. And I'm not talking about monitoring them like using AI tools or using a different type of tech that normally tech companies do. They set up an agent, try to monitor certain keywords, try to look for propaganda. We need people. And that's what I'm talking about. In the world of AI, monitoring of extremist chat platforms or communication systems must be done by people, because things that we can recognize might not be recognized by AI tools or computer systems. And this is one of the first steps, because we need to identify the threat correctly before thinking about disrupting it. So if you see conversation these days in Islamic State chat platforms or any other jihadist chat platforms, they are very, very normal. You might only see like these are just hobbyist people talking about drones, talking about technology, or just discussing different incidents. Even the San Diego mosque incident, you see them, they are just like getting angry on the attackers. But this is the first step, because they are definitely going to take action on that conversation. They are definitely going to move forward with those things. And I think the first thing we should focus on is correctly identifying the threat.
And Kai, what are some of the, to fix chatbots, make sure they don't do harm? What are the psychosocial guardrails you put on it? What can a chatbot, what can some of the companies you work with do to make sure those guardrails?
So I think to get at that, I guess what I'd want to critique first is some solutions that may not work. So right now, I think there's a general push towards more regulation, particularly through legislative reform, which is a natural response. But I think sometimes this can actually be kind of the wrong direction. And this is precisely why I've geared towards creating this topology that tries to understand the multiplicity of different threats here. So just recently, the House of Lords, for example, was discussing an amendment to the Crime and Policing Act, basically carving out a new crime that would be distributing a LLM or a chatbot that produces terrorist content. Fortunately, they've had an amendment to that subsequently, which would create a carve-out regarding that offense, which would be, well, it would not be a crime if, for example, you engaged in a written assessment of its safety profile, right? So essentially engaging in red teaming, etc. That's very good, because that will prevent, for example, stifling innovation, right? If you're a British company, you're creating an LLM, you don't want to be worried that you're creating a terrorist bot and that you might be charged for that. So that is positive. But at the same time, I would also say that creates issues that doesn't really resolve the problem, right? All these frontier labs, whether it's OpenAI, Anthropic, etc., they do engage in red teaming. So in essence, by trying to resolve, and for context, this kind of amendment came in response to this report by CCDH that some may have read, which kind of modeled out scenarios similar to what we saw at the FSU shooting and the Tumbler Ridge shooting. But part of the challenge there that I would say is, well, by carving out that amendment, you also make the legislation effectively redundant, right? You can't possibly prosecute a company who did engage in a threat safety analysis previously. So therefore, that's my long-winded way of saying we need other ways of going about this. And for example, when it comes to the algorithmic mirror, right there is we need tailored red teaming to address that. And Aaron kind of mentioned this before, which is that's particularly challenging when it comes to, for example, operational planning. We can often engage in single turns, kind of zero-shot prompting, right? We're asking for some capability, tips on an IED, something or other. If you're trying to mimic whether a model may indulge in sycophancy that could lead someone engaging in delusions, etc., that ultimately escalates to violence, when we actually look at the real-life cases, this happens over hundreds, if not many thousands of turns. That's very hard to replicate in red teaming. But suffice to say then that I think we need both legislative reform when it comes to, for example, the agentic recruiter, which is a prospective threat. But when it comes to the other issues, we much more need to gear towards better benchmarking, more red teaming, these kind of approaches. Thank you.
Great, keep them coming. Let's do another round. I warned you guys I was going to make you go up above because we have, just to really get it, I don't want people that were sat up above to feel like they're left out. So we have one on this corner and one on this corner. Do you guys mind with mics? And then we'll take one over here down in front.
Starting back there.
Starting all the way up at the top. When I say top, I'm getting you up those stairs because I'm sorry. I know we've got people sat all the way in the tiers. And I want to make sure you feel included in this close little family. Yeah, if you've got a mic over there, let's start there.
Hello, I'm Stanislas. I'm an independent researcher on computational propaganda and democratic backsliding. Thank you very much for this brave and exciting research. My question concerns the fact that we are seeing malicious actors today who are exploiting not only available technologies, but also the technical substrate of our information and financial infrastructures. In your opinion, what are the implications of this in terms of epistemic security when we look at radicalizing chatbot that can radicalize people and, for example, political interference, notably financial political interference? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And over here.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Divyan. My question is for Dr. Rajan. FGC9 was used in Myanmar and it's quite popular among white nationalists. Why do you think that jihadist groups are pretty absent in terms of its adoption? Do you think it's because of the efficacy of the gun or something else why jihadist groups are not using it? 3D printed guns per se. Thanks.
It's a really good question. And then, sorry guys, we're gonna get, where did I say? I said one here, and then we have one in the back. We'll do 4, and then that should take us to lunch. One right here and one in the back. You won't have to go to the gym after today's conference, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. For Dr. Allen, I noticed you don't talk about open source models much. Like there's also a lot of Frontier Lab red teaming, but the open source models have way less safeguards. So can you kind of speak to that a little bit? Thank you.
Great. And
my name is Maya. I'm doing my PhD about terrorism. I would like to know about the drones, Muskan. Do you think the drones are more focusing target during the military? If yes or no, please explain why. And the drones, I'm really interested about the drones, especially about the behavior aspect. Do you think it's keep the people like ongoing trauma? And what is your thought about this? And this using drones did change the strategy of war? Thank you.
Great. Okay, I think that was actually perfectly one question for each of you. So well done random selection. And let's move forward. Let's start with, it'll go Daria, Rajan, Kai, Muskan. So the first question for you, Daria, is kind of what are these epistemological questions of political interference, all the noise on the financial activity, and where can we go from there, and how this kind of affects a more systemic issue when we're thinking of terrorist finance. Oh, great, got a second.
I'm sorry. So actually the question is very interesting, but I feel that I cannot give you like a precise answer due to the fact that I don't really have the data. My research was not focused specifically on that aspect. So giving you an answer would be more of a guess. So I'm sorry for that, but I don't really know how to frame my answer. So I would rather pass the microphone to my colleague, maybe, that can give more of an idea and of an answer.
Well, maybe to keep it on you for a second, because this is a research conference, what data would you need access to and what stops you from getting that data? Because we often find, I could maybe counter all terrorism and it would be at the cost of privacy and other human rights, so what data would you love to be able to see to better understand, but where are their limitations and where do you think you could maybe get that data, and where is it like we probably shouldn't have access to that data because of privacy and other things?
Yeah, basically the implication would be, of course, privacy implications due to the fact that data are sensible. So, of course, having access to political data related to that specific issue would also go into the domain of jurisdiction regulations. For example, in the European Union, would be easier to have data about this specific topic, but maybe in other regions that would be actually harder. So the data I should look at are probably, I would say, data about. I don't really know how to frame this one. Like, I'm in a very hard. I'm having a hard time right now. I wasn't expecting that. So
that's okay. I think we're asking the big questions because this is difficult and we can't have all the data. In fact, for a lot of researchers, I think people have commented that we maybe even had tools 10 years ago for researchers online, like CrowdTangle and things that we don't anymore. But it'll be because of things like Cambridge Analytica, which was a research contract breach, not a data breach. And so then people maneuver and we have less access. So I think it raises a bigger question. Maybe you two can connect during the lunch break as well to further talk about
absolutely.
What like. Maybe over to you, Rajan, to talk a little bit about this very specific question about the FGC9. And it is a good point that most of the cases we're looking at in Europe, North America, Australia that are about 3D printed weapons, we're looking at largely white supremacist and neo-Nazi related communities and less at Islamist extremist jihadist networks. Any understanding of why?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. If you look at people who've been convicted for interacting with 3D printed firearms, maybe they're sharing blueprints, they're trying to make a gun, they're trying to fire a gun, over 90% of them are white nationalists. And it's really strange why this technology, which is ideologically agnostic, hasn't spread to different ideologies, right? And there's probably a few tentative explanations, let's say. We saw very active promotion amongst Telegram in certain Telegram chats of 3D printed firearms, sharing the blueprints, encouraging the followers to make the FGC9, because this is a way of getting a hold of a firearm without interacting with law enforcement or potential informer in the illicit market. So we saw that heavy promotion of it as well. There's also a cultural factor, the glorification of the Christchurch shooter, people looking to copycat that with a gun of their own. So I think that those are kind of drawing people, pushing people towards that. When it comes to jihadis, I think, well, this is across the board, but people would prefer conventionally manufactured firearms, much more reliable. And in a lot of the parts of the world where you have jihadist insurgencies and terrorist groups operating, there's no shortage of conventionally manufactured firearms. So why would you need to make a 3D printed firearm, sort of lower caliber, FGC9 is only 9mm cartridges? You know, why don't you go for a Kalashnikov style rifle, which you can easily find just for sale anywhere? So that's probably pushing people to other weapon sources. When it comes to jihadis in Europe, when I've spoken to investigators, they said, look, these designs have been circulated to a lower level in certain jihadi forums, like on Rocket Chat and Tech Haven. But when they look at people who are interacting with those designs, they decide on something much more low tech. All right, I could just go out, stab someone, I could run someone over if I really want to. I don't need to go to all of this extent. So it's probably a few factors combined that leads to the preference. But I would say it's only a matter of time before it does spread to different ideologies. So it's not restricted.
Yeah. Okay, let's go over here. But it's also really interesting that it really is just a rational choice model, whether it's the platform or the technology we're talking about. And I will say, if we even go back to 2019, the Halle, Germany attack was not just a manifesto and an attempted live stream, but was the release of a PDF of how to 3D print a gun in line with that. So we've been dealing with this increasing scale for a number of years now. All right, going over to you, and maybe you can also talk about the question after that on the drones and whether or not drones are largely military targeting or are we seeing civilian targeting, but go ahead and comment on this too.
So what I would like to add to it is that the reason why we don't see this overlap in the Islamist jihadist communities is because of how structured jihadist ecosystems are and the amount of funding they receive. Because most of the far-right extremists or, they go by the lone wolf culture. But when you look at jihadists, They are more organized, they have funding coming on, they have, access to the most advanced weaponry. So when you have access to an AK-47, why would you want to go for something 3D printed? So I think that is one of the main reasons why jihadists are not inclined towards 3D firearms. But as we move on and as people have more access to the 3D printers, or even if they don't have funding for the traditional arms or methods, I think they will definitely move towards 3D firearms, but not at the moment. As for my question about the drones, thank you, Maria. I think we need to better understand, when we talk about behaviors, we need to better understand the concept of jihad they are pushing. Jihad is not what is mentioned in Quran or the Islamic religious texts. What they are pushing is that if you want to be a part of jihad, if you want to conduct jihad or part of the Islamic State organization, you can do jihad from wherever you are. So what you can do is you can use the simplest of tools. Like drones is just an example, but you can use your kitchen knife and kill one of the kafirs and on a bright Sunday morning in London. And that is jihad for them. So for people who are, wired that way, for them, drone is just one of the tools. So if they can train people in making drones and using them like for targeting maybe military targets or maybe government targets, then that is best for them. That is what they are trying to achieve, although they have not achieved it yet. But if we keep on monitoring them, if we keep on looking at what they are discussing, what they are trying to achieve, I think we can even avoid certain things. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. And finally, Kai, a little bit about maybe what you've seen in trends with the open source AI models versus when you have to log on and have an account. I mean, when we've talked to some of the AI companies, they're saying, you have much more limitations when you're not fully logged in, just the time recall of how much the machine remembers of you in that interpersonal connection or reaction, or higher safety guard measures. What have you seen?
Yeah, so I think in my speech, I perhaps put a bit of a damper on the AI hype. I think, as I said, the kind of recruitment chatbot is not here yet, it's coming. Where I see the real threat right now is in the realm of these open source models, particularly ones that are obliterated, right? That's essentially the removal of all safety guardrails. You can do this very easily. You could download an open source model and obliterate it within minutes. You'll then have one of these models. It may be slightly out of date, but you'll have a model without any safety guardrails at all. You can then ask it information about tactical planning and the like. That's a very serious threat. Less so about the radicalization component, but more around someone who is already radicalized and is moving towards real world violence. So I see that as the most serious threat here. And I think a couple comments to add to that is, one, this also presents a key challenge for security personnel, right? There is much less, let's say, surfaces of intervention when it comes to these. You could possibly, yeah, sure, you could host one of these on your own servers, or you could just run it locally on your own device, including without internet access, right? So unless security services are monitoring that computer, you don't really have any signals regarding that. So that poses a key challenge there. I think as well regarding the legislative challenge. I mentioned before this legislation going through the House of Lords. Key questions there around, would that potentially outlaw obliterated models? If by the nature of the obliterated model, you are making it so you could produce any content that you want using it, is publishing that now an offense? Or is downloading an obliterated model an offense? My personal opinion is that this is probably the most key challenge when it comes to LLMs right now. I do think there needs to be more moderation around this, and tech companies need to think seriously before they release these models. But on the other side of the equation, I'll just add two caveats. So on the one hand, these tools can also be very helpful for us in terms of red teaming. So in my day-to-day, I do red teaming for labs of pre-deployment models. These kind of open source models can be very helpful for us because often we need an LLM to help judge the very large number of prompts that we're running through the model that we're testing. You can't possibly do that as a human. But if you're trying to run that through a standard model, you're putting through some, to put it mildly, some very questionable prompts. So it can be very useful to have a less safe model run those because it won't get flagged through safety guardrails, for example. The last point that I'll mention is all of this is to say that the importance of red teaming for the standard models that we have via the apps is still crucial. Professor Crone mentioned, I believe before, this is kind of a numbers game when it comes to terrorism. And most people are still just going to be using these online. Most people aren't going to be downloading these or have the perhaps knowledge of how to go about this. So I still think making ultimately these online models as safe as possible is crucial. But where this challenge comes in regarding open source ones is that it creates an irreducible systemic risk. We can make these online models as safe as possible, but a dedicated actor can always just go to an open source one. So there's always that irreducible risk there.